The next few weeks will be crucial to deciding Max Verstappen's immediate F1 future, and while Red Bull was busy introducing the new car concept it desperately hopes will be enough to convince him to stick around, Verstappen's management was busy holding talks with a rival team. There's a lot to unpick here, but let's start very briefly with that strong suggestion you may remember from a few months back when Verstappen was threatening to walk away from F1 entirely. That's basically receded now, thanks to F1's planned engine rule changes for 2027 and 2028. A sabbatical isn't really on the cards at this point. But while that was all being thrashed out, and the FIA was busy deciding Red Bull Powertrains has in fact built 2026's best internal combustion engine, Verstappen was busying himself dealing with Red Bull's wayward on-track form and questionable reliability. Canada yielded an encouraging breakthrough podium finish. Monaco yielded a front row grid start, or not because the engine shut down as the lights went out, and Spain yielded a quiet run to an unspectacular 5th place where, as Verstappen put it, he was just driving around by himself. And so Red Bull's form hasn't exactly been bad, just not the sort of title contending and race winning form it needs to show to convince a 4-time world champion this is the place to be. Coming to Austria, Red Bull's home race, that feeling of an imbalance of power between driver and team was palpable. Add in the fact that Red Bull has been almost hemorrhaging high-profile staff to rival teams over the past 12 months, with veteran chief engineer Paul Monahan the latest to be rumoured to be on his way, and you're left with a very real sense this is a team that's not merely in transition, but slowly coming apart entirely. If Verstappen leaves too, that really will mark the end of an era for Red Bull, and stories over the weekend of Verstappen's management team meeting with McLaren Racing CEO Zak Brown don't exactly help pour cold water on that particular fire. But that if is still a big if, because there's a much bigger game afoot here than Verstappen's manager simply doing his job and casting the net for better driving opportunities for his client. British news outlet The Mail Online published a story on the Thursday of the Austrian Grand Prix reporting that Verstappen's management had engaged in preliminary talks with McLaren about a potential deal. These talks certainly took place, and Brown took the meeting after being approached because, after all, that's his job, but this is not about some power play to lever Oscar Piastri immediately out of McLaren and get Verstappen into that seat for 2027. We know Verstappen has a contract with Red Bull running into 2028. We also know that Verstappen's contract contains a clause that allows him to exit the team if he's not inside the top 2 in the Drivers' Championship at some unspecified point in August 2026. But where does Verstappen go if he activates this clause? All the alternative top seats at Mercedes, Ferrari and McLaren are locked down for 2027. Charles Leclerc has just recently extended his mega deal with Ferrari into the 2030s. Lewis Hamilton has a contract for 2027 and is understood to hold an option for 2028 too. Reigning world champion Lando Norris and McLaren teammate Piastri are both understood to be under contract for next season at least, and George Russell was quoted in that Mail Online story as saying he will definitely be racing at Mercedes in 2027. When Mercedes announced Russell and Kimi Antonelli as its driver lineup for 2026, we mentioned how curious it was there was no reference to the lengths of the deals, or even a vague confirmation they were signed up to multi-year contracts. This was widely understood to be Toto Wolff keeping his options open in case Verstappen became available, but Mercedes and Russell insisted there was a multi-year agreement in place beyond the end of this season. Antonelli will certainly be on some kind of long-term agreement, dating back probably to his graduation to F1 in 2025, and his performances so far in 2026 certainly merit him remaining in place regardless. Whatever mechanism that existed to ensure Russell remains at the team beyond this year appears to have been triggered, closing off the only realistic short-term option for Verstappen that isn't staying at Red Bull. It should also mean the players further down the priority order in F1's driver market can start locking in their own plans. Flavio Briatore, for example, was recently quoted as saying he was waiting on any potential Mercedes driver availability before deciding Alpine's 2027 lineup. Although there's been no official confirmation from Mercedes yet, we can safely say Flavio can now do whatever he was planning to do about Franco Colapinto without needing to consider the potential availability of Russell or Antonelli. The bigger question is, where does all this leave Verstappen? And those tentative McLaren talks are a big part of that equation. This is about the longer term picture of F1's driver market in 2028 and maintaining pressure on Red Bull in the meantime. Verstappen's often said he wants to remain at Red Bull as long as he's racing in F1, but that loyalty only extends so far as Red Bull's competitive standing. Verstappen's average qualifying position so far in 2026 stands at 7.4, though that is in large part down to the first 3 races of the season when Verstappen's best qualifying was 8th in China. Since the enforced April break and Red Bull's first major upgrade of the season for round 4 in Miami, Verstappen hasn't qualified outside the top 6 and has twice made the front row of the grid, so performance has markedly and consistently improved, even though the power unit continues to be troublesome, particularly off the start line. Verstappen's management was quoted in the Dutch press ahead of Austria saying Verstappen wants to remain at Red Bull for life, but wasn't born to race in the midfield. How do they define where the midfield begins? That remains unanswered. What's most likely happening here is the Verstappen camp utilising what leverage it still holds in the driver market to prevent Red Bull becoming complacent. Red Bull knows Verstappen lacks viable options for 2027, the rest of the grid knows that too, and certainly Verstappen's management does. But what happens after that is a completely different question, and there's a realistic potential scenario here where Verstappen activates his exit clause this summer and then tries to squeeze Red Bull for a better deal to prevent the possibility of him joining a rival for 2028. Their priority is definitely for Max to remain at Red Bull, but only if the car is good enough to fight for titles. That remains the primary driving force here. And they know the driver market for 2028 is a lot more uncertain. So in the meantime, Verstappen wants to maintain pressure on his current team to get back to the title contending level that he expects. As we outlined earlier, Red Bull's been on an upward performance trajectory since Miami in early May, but the Austrian Grand Prix was a significant levelling up for Verstappen, a race in which for the first time this season he felt that he could legitimately compete for victory. The fact he finished sandwiched between the 2 Mercedes with less than 2 seconds blanketing the 3 cars tells you this was a tight battle, and Verstappen's race pace was unquestionably a match for what has usually been the dominant force in 2026 so far. Race winner Russell even admitted afterwards that Verstappen's pace had made his life uncomfortable. It was clear to see that Verstappen's early Q3 pace in qualifying on Saturday, where he lapped within a tenth of both Mercedes before a problem with the rear wing transitioning from straight mode to corner mode threw him into the barriers, was genuine. He was a proper threat to Mercedes in this race and very likely could have won it had he not started down in 5th and had to spend the early laps battling past Lewis Hamilton's energy-starved Ferrari. Even with that delay, Verstappen forced himself into contention, but then felt his pace in the second half of the race fell away, owing to an unspecified problem on the Red Bull's rear axle. Red Bull team boss Laurent Mekies left the circuit without hosting his usual post-race media debrief, so we weren't able to ask him what exactly was going on with Verstappen's car. But Red Bull did release a brief overview from Mekies in which he suggested Kimi Antonelli was actually the fastest driver in race trim, not Verstappen or Russell, and praised the job Red Bull did in adding what he estimates to be 1 second of performance to the car since the start of the season. A car which is now understood to be close to the regulation weight limit after previously giving away an estimated 0.2 of a second to being overweight. One of the most pleasing aspects for Red Bull will be the fact it was able to get this major Austria upgrade working properly after a difficult time in Friday practice. An overnight simulator shift from 2016 Formula E champion Sebastian Buemi helped Red Bull knock the car into shape for Saturday, and then what Mekies called Verstappen's magic did the rest. That upgrade was focused mainly on significant floor, bargeboard, sidepod and engine cover revisions to work better with the new front wing introduced at the previous race in Barcelona, all seemingly with the aim of driving more airflow to the rear of the car to energise the diffuser. Lack of rear grip is an ongoing and common complaint with this new generation of cars, which have suddenly lost the abundance generated here by the previous ground effect designs, so work is being done to claw back some of that lost performance up and down the grid. Red Bull has added some Ferrari-style detail to the rear corner of its floor, ahead of the rear tyre, and introduced a tidier version of the so-called exhaust wing that Ferrari also pioneered and that will now be banned for 2027. This sacrifices some pure engine power to create back pressure in the exhaust and blow the rear wing to add downforce. Obviously, everyone needs to be wary of getting carried away with just one strong race. We only need to consider the fact Ferrari went from race winner to abject disappointment in the space of one high-altitude circuit to realise how quickly the picture can change in F1. And Verstappen also feels Red Bull has some work to do to rediscover its former title-winning edge. But there's no doubt Red Bull has suddenly taken a massive step forward in the short term, and the timing couldn't have been more perfect, just as Verstappen's management team fired its first major driver market warning shot for 2028.